Now, the budget brinkmanship has cost the world's largest economy $24 billion, as well as the trust of investors around the globe. Let's get different opinions and more in-depth analysis from our panel of guests here. With me in the studio is Ben Aris. It's good to have you with us. He's the editor-in-chief of Business News Europe. In London, we have Nick Parsons, head of European and UK research for National Australia Bank. And in Hong Kong, Richard Hainsworth, the CEO of Universal Credit Rating Group. Now, first to Ben, you thought before that there wouldn't be a deal. But here we are, default averted. And isn't it a reason to celebrate?
Yes, indeed. I mean, the default would have been extremely damaging and cost America, A, a lot of money, and B, the threat of driving it into recession. I mean, it's a growth killer if they did go over the top. But at the end of the day, I mean, Obama has no real reason to do a deal in so much as this was a law passed and upheld by the Supreme Court. And, you know, my perspective on this is that the lawmakers have a duty to fund laws that are passed, and that's what they're there for. They can't object to laws simply because they don't like them. But it shows, in a way, how dysfunctional American politics have become, that we had this fight in the first place.
I mean, they did take quite a while to reach, that 2 weeks deadlock to reach to this point. But we're going to come back to that point. Nick, your predictions were that the US dollar will steady up from now on. Does it mean that the world should stop worrying and trust in American economy from now on?
I think trust is perhaps too strong a word. They can certainly hope that the American economy recovers. And we think that the US is the only country in G10 that's going to get close to something like 3% growth next year. So I think that the fact that we can now put this behind us is a positive. We can now look to business spending, business investment and an improvement in consumer confidence, which over time ought to help support the value of the US dollar, because we have to remember always that currencies are a relative price. You can't sell one currency without buying another. Currencies are always relative prices. And when you look around the world right now, it's difficult for investors to decide what they would prefer rather than the US dollar. We can criticize the dollar on many fronts, and we can criticize America. We can spend all day criticizing America. But the fact is that it's difficult to see in the short term what the alternatives to the US dollar actually are.
There is no doubt that clearly the dollar did suffer a huge blow now. We've been hearing how it's sort of a wake-up call for the world to stop relying on it. And right now I'm just going to, let's listen to Francis Lan, CEO of GEO Securities, who I spoke to earlier on. This is what he had to say.
Everybody has to think of starting to de-Americanize the financial order. I think the US dollar has an inordinate influence on the financial market. I think it is time to diminish the role of the US dollar in international settlement.
Richard, given what Nick Parsons has said there about the American dollar and that it is steadying up a little bit now, what do you make of the comments that we've just heard from Francis Lan?
You're talking to Richard?
Richard,
well,
yes.
I entirely agree with them.
What is this de-Americanizing that we keep hearing about? What does it mean to you?
Okay, well, obviously the American dollar is the largest quantity of currency in the world. The American economy still remains the largest in the world. The problem is the reality that the Americans can't be trusted anymore. Whereas over the last 50 years or so, the Americans have been predictable, they have kept to their laws, they have paid back all of their obligations. This time round, in reality, America did default. It defaulted on its obligations to its own people. It defaulted on obligations it had made in law when it set up laws and it set up certain programs that needed to be funded, and the sequestration actually didn't fund those laws. So there was a default. The problem for the rest of the world is that we have to create other structures. We have to create them. We can't look for them. We have to find them. And that's the problem for today.
Nick, what do you make of what Richard just said?
I find it very difficult to believe that America defaulted. Yes, we can argue about its moral obligations, but show me a lawyer who will argue on moral grounds rather than legal grounds, and I think you'd struggle. So America did not default. It hasn't defaulted, and I believe that even if it had
no, I'm sorry, I
gone
can't
beyond the
accept that,
deficit ceiling,
because if you pay somebody, if you promise to pay someone, you don't pay them, that's a default.
He's got a point there. Richard's got a point.
I'm not aware of anyone who hasn't been paid.
Nick, Richard has a point there. He's saying that if you don't pay somebody that you owe, that is a default. And clearly America has done that now. They were nearly at a default. No. So you don't think they were? I'm
sorry. Nearly at a default is not the same as a default.
They didn't default. They didn't default on their external debts. They didn't default on their external debts to people who bought their treasury bills, but they did default on the payments to their government employees. If I employed someone and didn't pay them, they would take me to court. So they defaulted on their internal obligations.
Let me get Ben wants to jump in. Ben wants to jump in.
But it's still a default.
I come in on
Let me get Ben to jump in.
On Richard's side, in so much as what underpins money, what is money? It's a note, it's a promise. It's a promise that I will exchange this for goods or services of equivalent worth, but the money itself is valueless. And what America's done is, though it didn't default in so much as it's going to pay its bills, nevertheless it's undermined that trust, that promise that they will pay. And this is damaging. I mean, in the short term it costs nothing because they're going to pay up like they should do, but in the longer term they're undermining their reputation, as Chris said, of reliability, and that's going to hurt them. Larry Summers said in an op-ed earlier this week that this is the point that historians could point at and say the beginning of it's shown that Americans' political system is dysfunctional, and then that destroys trust, and that's going to hurt them economically in the long run.
How is this going to affect China? Richard, I'm going to go back to you. Is this good news or bad news for China? On one hand, its big powerhouse is the rival has taken a hammering, but on the one hand, Beijing is sitting on all that dollar debt.
I think it's very worrying for China, and the Chinese authorities themselves have said they're agonizing about it. They are trying to find alternatives. They are setting up currency swaps with other countries. They are looking for other assets in which they can invest. They want to get rid of their dollars. They would prefer to move into the euro. So I think that China, looking at the long run, is going to move away from the American dollar as the currency, as the store of value for its savings. It's no longer trustworthy.
Nick is shaking his head. Nick, you want to jump in?
Well, China added to its holdings of US securities over the last quarter, and so too did many central banks around the world. I take on board all the points about America's faith and trust being severely damaged. Brand America, if we could call it that, has received severe blows over the course of the last few weeks. But in terms of the reserve currency status and this process of de-Americanization, we should note that that's been ongoing for the last 15 years. If you go back to 2000, around 71% of all the world's central bank reserves were held in US dollars. Today, that figure is down to around 61 or 62%. It's an incremental change, and it does mean that over the course of the next 15 or 20 years, the US dollar will be a minority holding in central bank reserves. So yes, the power of the US is diminished, its power of seigniorage has been diminished. We won't be able, I think, to see a repeat of what President Nixon said in the 1960s, that it's our dollar and your problem. I think over time it will be increasingly a problem for the United States. But we should keep a sense of perspective here. That time frame is more likely 20 years. It's certainly not 20 minutes or 20 hours. It is taking place. It will continue to take place.
Okay, let's recall what the deal actually is now. Now, the debt ceiling's been raised beyond its $17 trillion. The deal reopens the government until January 15th and allows it to continue borrowing until February the 7th. Now, a question to all of you: will the bubble eventually explode? What will this mean for the rest of us? Let's start with we'll start with Ben here.
Well, why this whole fight was so disappointing is because everybody's focused on the wrong problem. America's debt to GDP is now 104%, slightly more. And that's an unsustainable level. And what needs to be done is to bring the debt down. This whole question about refinancing the debt misses the point. The problem is, how do we get rid of this debt in the first place? And then this whole question of raising the debt ceiling will go away. And until this, the government in the States sort of focuses on that problem and does something about it, which is growing the economy is the easiest way to solve it. Until they do that, then we're going to have repeats of this fight ongoing, because it's become a political tool in the way that it never was before.
Nick, what do you make of the fact that a lot of the experts that we've been hearing from are saying that, this is just a temporary fixture that comes the 7th of February. This might all go back to where it is, where it was a couple of hours ago. What do you think?
It's certainly possible that we get a third series of this soap opera in America, but equally possible is the fact that the Republicans might learn a few lessons from their crushing defeat over the course of the last couple of weeks. And a Republican Party which exists simply to oppose may well find it's doing more damage to itself than it is to the Democrats and President Obama. So I'm perhaps offering here a ray of hope for global financial markets and the global economy, that it's by no means certain that when we wind the clock forward 3 months, we're going to get a precise repeat of this, because quite simply the Republicans' tactics failed. They failed abysmally. They openly acknowledge that they failed, and it's very difficult to see why they would come back with more of the same into January and ahead of that February 7th deadline that you rightly mentioned.
Quick last word from you, Richard Hainsworth there in Hong Kong.
I think we will see this again. The US is spending too much money. They have to keep borrowing. Unless they find the political will to increase their revenues, I doubt very much whether they will decrease their expenditures. So I see this happening again and again and again. This is an accelerating process. I will agree with Nick that the timescales have to be given perspective. I would also agree that it's a longer-term thing. Civilizations don't fall in 10 or 20 minutes. They take decades to fall. But I think that we're at the beginning of the fall of the American civilization.
The beginning of the fall of the American civilization. That's according to Richard Hainsworth there, CEO of Universal Credit Rating Group in Hong Kong. I'd like to thank my other guest, Ben Harris, Editor-in-Chief of Business News Europe here in our studios in Moscow, and Nick Parsons, Head of European and UK Research, National Australia Bank in London. Thank you very much to all our guests for sharing their insights in this ongoing story.